So part of what we've been doing for the last 10 years or so is trying to understand if there are any consequences for us attending racially separate congregations. I'm just going to highlight a couple here. So this book that you've heard mentioned, Divided by Faith, really focused on that by going to separate congregations, we reproduce the racial inequality that exists today. Racial inequality is not getting less. If you measure it in terms of economics, it's getting more. In 1988, the average white in the United States made 10 times what the average African American and Hispanic made in terms of their wealth. Everything you own minus everything you owe. So the wealth gap was tenfold in 1988. Now, 2007 is our latest data, it's 15-fold. Because it takes money to make money, so the gap keeps getting bigger. We have found that churches help increase that gap. Why would that be? I can't go into all the details, but think about how we'd say you get a job. It's not what you know, it's who you know. So churches represent a plane in which people of the same race get together and make relationships with one another. They help each other because they're trying to be good and moral people. But they help the people they know, which are the people in their churches. Because their churches are so racially segregated, we're busy helping each other within our own racial groups. Because we have such a gap in resources, it means some groups have a lot more to help one another with, some groups have a lot less to help one another with, even though they have a lot more needs. So we are reproducing racial inequality. Racial essentialism is a term which means that, well, I have to say this. Nobody used the term race until about the 1500s. And usually historians will argue that race came to be as a justification for slavery. So we created a concept called race. Part of what we do as we gather in these separate congregations is we reify, we say that race is a real concept, so real that it leads us to gather in separate congregations. Most people aren't doing this intentionally, right? We just go where we know people or where we feel comfortable. But we essentialize race. We make it even more real in those processes. We strengthen racial division, again, because we're emphasizing this category of race, and we're spending time separate, making all these relationships separate from one another. And this one is interesting. A lot of work's been done, both theologically and then by psychologists and political scientists. They say, because groups can understand people in their own group a whole lot better than they can understand people in a different group, that ultimately groups don't work very well together. We first look out for the people in our own group. So one of the things that they have found is that ultimately, in a democracy in particular, how groups get things done is it happens in the political sphere. They each bring their interests into the political sphere, and then they duke it out in a sense. So even Christians, being in separate congregations, ultimately relate to each other politically rather than as Christians with one another. So what should be? Fortunately, we got this guy, Jesus, who knew a lot. And he had this one prayer. There's only one prayer in the Bible where Jesus is praying for us today. My prayer is not for them, the disciples alone. I pray for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. Now, Jesus could have prayed a lot of things, that they all might be Christian, that they all might be good and moral people, but he prayed that they would be one. It almost seems impossible, doesn't it? If there are like a billion Christians in the world, how could there be one? So I think we often say, well, metaphysically, we're one in Christ, at some high level, but we don't really have to show that at our lived level. But Christ prayed that we'd all be one, and then he gave us a reason why he prayed that. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so the world may believe you sent me. Now, as often happens when you want to emphasize a point, you say it again. And he did. May they be brought to complete unity to let the world know you sent me. So notice what we got here. Being one will tell the world Christ is real and people will come to faith. Christ said that. I'm not making it up, right? but I still didn't believe Christ. So I actually did a study of Acts, which is the original church, and if you follow that, it's pretty amazing what happens there. Anytime it mentions that Christians were in complete unity, it's almost always followed with something like, and many new believers were added that day, and 3,000 new believers were added, and rabbis became Christian, and it goes on and on. So, ultimately we are to work for both unity and justice, and I'll come back to that. Our houses are called to be houses of prayer for all nations. What can be? Now getting more into the sociology. So we spent, again, a number of years saying, are there any benefits if you have multiracial churches beyond what Christ is saying? So what actually happens sociologically? So one of the things